Hello students and welcome back to the Sports Nutrition series of videos. Today we're going to continue by talking about the caloric expenditure and the thermoregulation. So expect to learn what are the kinetics of oxygen consumption, how to calculate the total daily energy expenditure, as well as how we regulate the body temperature during physical activity. Hi, I'm Tommy. I'm a human nutrition student and researcher at the university. What I do in this type of videos is to synthesize my classes at the university so then I can explain and teach you the best and most valuable information you need to know. So let's begin by talking about the kinetics of oxygen consumption. So kinetics of oxygen consumption. This is the cardiorespiratory fitness. And the lower cardiorespiratory fitness is correlated with lower health and higher death probability. And it is also related to the dynamic exercise. The cardiorespiratory fitness is measured on a moderate high intensity of exercise, large muscle groups, for example, running using the legs, the arms, the back, during a prolonged time. That's why it's correlated with health. And there is also an integration of different metabolic pathways. We have the ATP, the phosphocreatine, the glucose anaerobic, the glucose aerobic, and the fat oxidation as well. And here we find this concept, the EPOC, the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, also called the depth. Why the depth? Because this is a post-exercise oxygen consumption due to an earlier oxygen deficit. So when we start to exercise, we have a deficit in oxygen due to the anaerobic metabolism. And after we finish the exercise, we have an oxygen consumption to compensate that initial deficit. So elite athletes take a short time while the untrained take longer to reach the oxidation. This is the perfect energy substrate for aerobic exercise. Indeed, the aerobic metabolism, oxidation of glucose and then fat. So if you take long time, you are untrained. If you take short time, you are trained up. When there is a higher oxygen deficit, there is a higher depth, aka EPOC, as I said. What are the causes of EPOC? Why do we still consume oxygen after we stop training? Well, because we have myoglobin oxygen reserves in the muscle, so we have to restore them. There is also ATP and phosphocreatine reserves. We have to recreate the phosphocreatine. And there is also the lactic acid formed, and we have to utilize it some way. So these are a few things that we must do to get back to normal. And to do that, we use oxygen. That's why we have an excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And at high intensity and higher time of exercise, we have a higher EPOC. On the other hand, we have the measurement of VO2 max. This is done directly or indirectly. The direct one is using ergospirometry, which is the best integrator of the cardiorespiratory fitness. Here we use the treadmill or a stationary bike that measures the watts, which is correlated with the VO2 max. So the ergometer increases the exercise intensity, and we use a gas analyzer to estimate the VO2 max, so the volume of oxygen consumed. And the liters of oxygen per minute are also expressed as liters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight minute. They are related to the METs. Do you remember them? The metabolic equivalent of task. And there are some portable equipments that are available to estimate the METs of each job, of each task. So we can estimate the caloric consumption of each and every job we can do. And here we have to mention the VO2 peak. This is a single maximum value measured, and it's not enough to determine the VO2 max. But the VO2 peak equals the VO2 max when there is a plateau and there is an increase in oxygen consumption less than 150 milliliters per minute. That is a plateau. When the blood lactate equals 8 millimoles per liter. Also when the respiratory exchange ratio, the R, is more than 1.1, do you remember that 1 equals 100% glucose? Then chances are 1.1 is more than enough to determine that VO2 peak equals VO2 max. And also when the maximum heart rate is close to the theoretical maximum heart rate. We all know that famous formula 220 minus your age. On the other hand, we have the indirect method. This is an estimation by tests and mathematical calculation. It's validated by the direct VO2 max correlated to the physiological response and the test results. So if you get this result, chances are you have this VO2 max. These are tests on treadmill, exercise bike, step or field test, running or walking for a certain distance or for a certain time. And there is an expression of the results and normative values. They are measured in liters per minute, oxygen. They are expressed in milliliters per kilogram per minute, then also expressed in fat-free kilograms. This is to equal the difference between males and females because females have more fat. And then it can also be expressed as multiples of METs. Why? Because 1 MET is indeed 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of fat-free weight per minute at rest. So now that we know all of these kinetics of oxygen consumption, we can start taking a look at the caloric expenditure in sport. The total daily energy expenditure calculation. So we have two things here to define: the basal metabolic rate and the resting metabolic rate. The BMR, basal metabolic rate, is measured at rest and awake, doing absolutely nothing. And it's equal more or less 160 to 290 milliliters of oxygen per minute. On the other hand, the resting metabolic rate has less rigorous conditions. The daily metabolic rate is equivalent to 70% of the calories burned, but only in normal people, because in athletes, it's lower, because they burn a lot more calories due to the exercise they do. So, knowing that, the total daily energy expenditure is the rest metabolic rate, which includes the sleep metabolic rate, and the arousal, which is the awakening energy expenditure we have, together with the thermic effect of food, yes, for example, proteins, so the energy we use to digest food, plus the spontaneous physical activity, for example, walking to the university, and the TEA, the thermic effect of activity, going to the gym or doing a competition. So BMR depends on body surface area and fat-free mass. And the equations for the BMR calculation are these mainly. And the most famous one is probably the Harris-Benedict formula. Then there is also the Mifflin, Owen, and the Cunningham formula, which is the most accurate because the other ones tend to underestimate the BMR. Remember, this is an indirect method of estimation. And the oxygen consumption by organ, well, at rest, the liver is the one that uses the most oxygen. It's also the largest, followed by the brain, then the skeletal muscle, kidneys, and heart. But when exercising, the skeletal muscle is the one that uses the most oxygen. So what are the factors that increase the total daily energy expenditure? The physical activity, of course, the diet thermogenesis, the amount of proteins we have to digest, the climate as well, the stress, and pregnancy. 1 MET is 3.5 kilocalories per kilogram per minute, and 1 liter of oxygen is 5 calories expended, more or less. And here we have to differentiate between the gross, which is the total energy consumption, versus the net energy consumption, which takes in account only the physical activity. So now let's take a look at what is the correlation between the total daily energy expenditure we have and our weight. So if we weigh more, we have more calories burned because of a higher oxygen consumption. But when we want to lower our weight, well, we have to choose mainly walking as the first choice when selecting an exercise. And there is a difference in the caloric expenditure due to the terrain. So a paved surface multiplies the energy consumption by 1.0, a plugged field by 1.5, hard snow by 1.6, and sand dunes by 1.8. That's why it's very, very demanding running on sand. Then uphill there is a higher energy consumption and downhill a lower energy consumption. But on slopes steeper than 12% downhill, there is a little bit more energy consumed to brake and to not sleep. And we have to say that at more than 8 kilometers per hour, the energy expenditure is almost the same for all distances regardless of speed. And the energy consumed on the flat surface, so the paved surface by 1.0, equals the weight times the distance. And more energy is expended by weighting the feet than the back. So if, for example, we want to increase our energy expenditure doing the same exercise, well, we can put some weight on our feet rather than on our back if we are walking, for example, because you are swinging the weight and you are consuming more calorie that way. But you have to be careful because there is a more impact on the joints when running with ballast, and it increases the risk of injury. So what's the energy consumption athletes? Well, it depends on the training volume and weight. Those two determine the caloric intake. But on average, we say 3,000 calories for an active male, more if he is an elite athlete, and 2,500 calories for an active female, more if she is an elite athlete. And now it's time to talk about the thermoregulation. So how we are able to change our body temperature depending on the needs. We humans are homeothermic. That means that we try to maintain our body temperature, especially in the core. And we measure the core temperature in the clinic using esophageal temperature, which is more reliable and accurate but not at all practical. The rectal one, which is accurate and easy to measure but can be uncomfortable for certain individuals. The tympanic channel, which is easy but not very comfortable and less accurate due to the external air influence because air cools. The oral temperature, which is easy but not so accurate because the expired air is cold and the air cools again, using pills with internal sensors. And the auxiliary one, which is probably the best one, is the most commonly used, it's approximate, and well, it may give an excessive error, but it's very, very practical. So during exercise, we increase our body temperature, and there is a variable increase that follows the circadian rhythm. We have similar values at the same time of the day. That's why early in the morning, we tend to have more cold than in the mid-afternoon. Higher body temperature is correlated with higher body calorie content, and 75% of exercise is converted into heat. Everything gives off heat when doing work. Yeah, think about your mobile phone or your computer. When they work a lot, they produce heat. We do the same. So let's take a look at the body heat energy balance. We have the heat removal and the heat gain. The heat removal, we use radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. The radiation using infrared emission absorption, and there must always be a gradient for radiation to work. Then conduction, which is done by contact, and it's not that important as we don't touch things normally. And then we have convection, which is the most important one. We can use either water or air. So water will remove a lot of heat, 25 times faster than air, but we can also use air to cool down. And then evaporation, from body to water molecule. This is done by breathing, sweating, and skin losses of heat in form of water molecule. The main eliminators are radiation when at rest and evaporation during exercise. And we have to mention that sweating is not equal to evaporation, because if when you sweat, you remove it, you're not letting it do its thing, and you're not going to cool down. So not always sweating equals evaporation. On the other hand, heat gain. This is due to metabolic internal heat and heat absorbed from the environment, the external one. The metabolic internal would be thermogenesis, from the brown fat, for example. So how does the body regulate the temperature? Well, there is a behavioral regulation, which is voluntary, and we do it to avoid cold or heat and facilitate the regulation. This is dressing and undressing. And then we also have the physiological regulation. This is involuntary, and it has negative feedback mechanisms using thyroid, thermogenesis, hypothalamus, and vessel. Here we have to mention the hypothalamus, which is the thermoregulatory center, and it uses peripheral and central thermoreceptors. So the effectors are the temperature increase, the shivering chills, more brown fat, as I said, arterial vasoconstriction, thyroxine, and catecholamine. Higher temperature is correlated with higher heart rate and lower beat volume. Remember the cardiovascular drift. If we increase a lot the heart rate, we are not going to be able to increase the beat volume. There's not enough time to actually feel the heart that much. Then higher temperature is also correlated with higher sweating, higher ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and higher aldosterone. Now let's take a look at thermoneutrality. It is the ability to maintain body temperature without shivering or sweating. Important. When we move out of range, there is a heat or cold stress. And because of that, we can find three main situations here: the heat stress, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. The heat stress is measured using the temperature of the specific humid globe. This takes in account the solar radiation and the humidity from the ground. And higher humidity, higher sweating. And this has to do with the heat cramp. So a heat stress can give painful contractions, and it may be related to dehydration and low electrolyte. So what we have to do is to rehydrate ourselves and remineralize ourselves as well. And then we have the heat exhaustion. This is when there is fatigue, higher breathing, higher heart rate, when he or she is pale, damp, has nausea, diarrhea, hypotension, and the possible cardiovascular shock. In this situation, we have to elevate the feet, replenish fluids and electrolytes. And it is continuous and ongoing, so it may give heat syncope and even loss of consciousness. And it can occur with or without exercise, even at less than 39 degrees Celsius and in untrained individuals. Indeed, this is very common in the south of Spain, near Seville, because in the summer it's very, very hot. And then we have the heat stroke. This is a life-threatening situation in which we have a body temperature of 40 to 41, and it can cause liver and kidney failure, as well as muscle cell death, the rhabdomyolysis. And it can occur in resting situations due to circulation problems. This is a medical emergency, and we have to lower the temperature with water and ice, same as we do when there is a higher fever. It can be even irreversible and can lead to coma. When talking about thermoregulation, we have to mention acclimatization, to exercise in hot environments. This is the adaptation to the climate. And to do that, we need to exercise in these conditions 1 to 2 hours per day for at least 2 weeks. And this is what the athletes do when they have a competition in a warm country. On acclimatization, there is a lower rectal temperature, a lower heart rate, and a higher sweating, which is diluted. And it's important to replenish potassium because there is a lot of potassium loss while there is a retention of sodium and chlorine in sweating. So very, very important to replenish potassium. And you have to know that acclimatization is reversible. That means if you stop exercising in those conditions, you're going to lose that adaptation. Okay, this is it for this video. I hope you understood everything I said. If you didn't, there is a comment section down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to your friends and family to spread this knowledge to them as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one, in which we are going to start taking a look at the macronutrients for the athletes. To be precise, we will start with the carbohydrates. So I will see you there. Hope you enjoyed.